All right. Thank you so much, Christos. And yes, we've finally gotten underway. So I hope everyone's had like a good morning session so far. So by way of introduction, so I'm sort of one of the co-founders of the Indigenous Studies discussion group here with Oliver, who's also here. And we started this in 2019, and this is sort of the first time that many of us are sort of meeting in such large numbers in person. And I'm very, very thrilled with the sort of turnout. But when I'm not badgering you with emails about the conference, I'm doing a PhD here at the law faculty. So I look at like the English East India Company and how they sort of navigate and sort of create legal systems which indigenous peoples have to navigate. So a lot of it has to do with like criminal trials and proceedings. So empire and sort of legal systems is what I broadly work on. If I can take a moment to introduce Tony as well. So Tony is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and is an author and a healthcare analyst with the NHS, which is the National Health Service for the UK. Tony is also a member of the Native Americans in the UK group and has contributed to the Exeter Chiefs for Change campaign. So in addition to Tony, we were hoping to be joined today by Leandra Neffin, who's sort of been instrumental in sort of bringing this together, putting us in touch with Tony. But unfortunately, because of health reasons, she won't be able to join today. But when you do see this recording, Leandra, thank you so much for making this possible. But if we could then sort of just jump straight into it, and uh, given that sort of you were quite involved in this group that Leandra also started, which was Native Americans in the UK. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about sort of finding community while you're abroad and what this collectivity sort of means to you.
Thank you very much for that. And let me just thank all of you for the opportunity to join you today at this conference. I appreciate it and look forward to the conversation. Being a Native American in the UK can be very isolating because you're more often than not the only one that you know. Certainly that has been the case for me until fairly recently, and I've lived in the UK for about 20 years. So in terms of being Native American, it's been about kind of looking back at home, you know, and to keep connected to our people, but also kind of dealing with different issues that come up with on your own, really, and not knowing whether you're the only one dealing with it or whether others might be as well. And this is where this community group that Leandra created has been so instrumental. I learned about it 2019, I believe, when there was a BBC Radio 4 program that had featured Leandra and other Native Americans about the work that they were trying to do to create a sense of community. And so I used Google, managed to get in touch with Leandra, and we've built a great friendship from that point on. And it actually has been hugely helpful for me in the sense of knowing that there are other Native Americans here, people that I can just, say hi to and kind of connect with, just as people having a, that similar heritage and experience here. And it's also proved invaluable, I think, especially when we were dealing with issues around the Exeter Chiefs Rugby Club and some of the questions that came up around there and the fight to persuade them to end their Native American branding. And so that is where I think us as a group, we grew stronger in the sense that we were able to connect with each other, being able to just sense check different things that people might say or try to work out, well, what's the best way to respond to this, or just providing support to each other. So I have found that absolutely invaluable. And it's certainly helped me as a Native American being here today.
All right, thank you so much, Tony. And so you did mention the Exeter Chiefs for Change campaign, and that's really a very, very sort of monumental kind of achievement. So we did do a program about this as part of the Indigenous Studies discussion group earlier this year. But I was wondering if you could sort of walk us through that a little bit. I mean, what the issue was and how it was addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Exeter Chiefs Rugby Club had Native American branding and a mascot, I believe they called Big Chief, since about 1999. The club has been around for 150 years, but about 20 years, well, 22 years ago, they had introduced this Native American branding. And it's one of those things where, as a Native American, you know about, but you feel like there's not much you can really do. And being one person, that is hard, right? And especially if you don't know others that are here. This really did change, I think, everything for us, really. So everything with the Chiefs really began when a group of supporters of the club had raised questions about whether this mascot, whether this branding was still appropriate. This came out at the height of the George Floyd death, and all the reflections that were going on, all the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of these questions. And so these supporters were thinking about, amongst all of these, what does it mean about having a rugby club that they dearly love, who embodies itself on caricatures of Native Americans? What does that actually mean? And so one of them from this group had gotten in touch with Leandra, and then we started to work together with the group from that point on. And so, we regularly, applied each of our skills and experiences. Some of us had, particularly from the Exeter Chiefs group, had PR experience, so knew how to send, communications, that sort of thing. And of course, myself and Leandra and others drew on our experience as Native Americans. And also networks of other Native Americans in the United States that have been fighting this issue every day for decades with American sports clubs. Basically, the Exeter Chiefs had imported, what they thought was a brilliant idea of racism in American sports clubs, having no understanding or appreciation of the context behind it, that we're more than just a drawing or whatever, and more than just a branding exercise. And they don't have any of the context, and they didn't really care about it at all. So the group, so us as natives, worked very closely with the Exeter Chiefs for Change group in this fight. And so again, drawing on each of our strengths to try to keep focus on making this change, and we were able to do that through social media, largely because we were limited in terms of what we could do in person given the pandemic. But it helped us create, being remote in a way strengthened us, because we could work together wherever we were and respond in near enough to real time to do that.
Absolutely. I think that's very, very sort of interesting how this sort of started and then all sort of had to go online. But I was wondering, sort of having sort of lived on both sides of the Atlantic, do you see that there was sort of differences in the way that issues like this, like you said, this seemed to be an American import into the UK. Do you see sort of a difference in how it was portrayed here or how it was in the United States?
Well, I have to say, so one of the things that surprised me isn't so much the differences, but some of the similarities that we ran into. And I think that was quite concerning for me. So generally speaking, in terms of the UK and perceptions, especially looking in the media, we are, I think, generally seen as people of the past. We're not here anymore. We are what you read about in the books or watch in I don't know, a John Wayne film or something like that, right? That's who Native Americans are for most people, because they just don't know about us. And we are a small fraction of the wider empire, right? In terms of indigenous people, if you think of indigenous in a global sense, an empire in the sense of the British Empire, right? We are just one part of that. And as I said, there aren't very many Native American people here. There's a much stronger presence of people, for example, from South Asia, the Caribbean, and Africa than are indigenous North Americans, right? So a lot of the ideas, I think, that people see within film and television, books, and so forth, some of these still get ingrained. And there were in the past, these Wild West shows that were carried out here in the UK. So having, quote, cowboys and Indians pretending that they're fighting like they did in their, quote, good old days, without understanding what was really behind all of that, around the poverty that the Native Americans involved face, and the trauma that they had, and basically having to go relive this loss in essence every day when they're actually, there's a sense of trauma there, and it leaves scarring because people like me end up having to explain some of this to people that are using those sorts of things to justify different caricatures that they have, and to say, well, we're just honoring you. But back to the point I was making about the similarities, when the Exeter Chiefs when their supporters were fighting to keep the branding and the logo, I heard and saw so many of the arguments that are made in the US. To justify, for example, I don't know, the Atlanta Braves baseball team, the Washington football team, and so on. All of these ideas around, well, we're honoring you. You should be honored that we're doing this. We're educating our fans about you, because otherwise they wouldn't know. I heard those same arguments here, and that was disappointing. In terms of the media, I have to say, without getting too specific, areas where I expected to see support, I didn't. And interestingly, areas where I didn't expect to see so much support, I did. And that was a surprise for me. I don't know, newspapers that are generally more, how shall I say, racially aware or conscious weren't there when some of these issues were coming up, or if they were there supporting the Chiefs, either directly or indirectly, having interviews, with the chief executive who was perpetrating all of this, right? These are things I did not expect. In the US, it's again a complicated landscape. People that consider themselves politically progressive will turn a blind eye to this. There are still sponsors of I don't know, the Atlanta Braves or other teams that are using these caricatures. There's not that we've had enough of this, we're drawing a line. That reflection isn't there. So it's some of the similarities that worry me, but the big difference is that people in the UK as a whole, and I think in the media too, just don't know enough about us and think that we're people of the past. And so you see little marks of Native Americans anywhere. I was watching EastEnders not long ago, and there's a scene, in one of the characters' houses, there's actually the logo of Indian motorcycles, and it's just a giant Indian head. It's like, well, why would you put that there of all things, right? And it's like, it was all okay. No one even thought about, well, this is actually, does this seem right? No one had thought about that. Or that teepees, or you can go to Argos or Tesco or whatever and buy teepees, or you go on Amazon, you can find, Indian princess costumes or whatever it may be, or become a chief for the day, right? And I say that in quotes, obviously. But all of these things are just ubiquitous. And I think that's telling. That it's there, but people just don't know enough about it to say, hey, is this right? And in the US, it's still happening, but the difference is that there are far too many people who don't care. They do know, but they don't care, and they're going to do it in spite of it all. So there's a less of a blessing of ignorance, if you see what I mean. There's a greater burden of responsibility, I think, in the US. So there is some difference to this, but it is here too.
No, I think a lot of what you said sort of really resonates, because sort of being an Indian, but of a very different kind, like geographically from India.
We were confused with you though, right?
So I mean, I do completely see sort of these fragments of what people consider to be like idealized representations of India, or like Indians being Native Americans and things like that. So that's really very striking in terms of like how it's used very casually. So I think empire is sort of everywhere, but at the same time nowhere, and I'm quoting here. But I was wondering, so given sort of this very heterogeneous kind of legacy of empire, like the British Empire sort of manifests very, very differently across different geographies and different times. Do you sort of think that there is currently sort of a mood to have some sort of honest reconciliation, or do you think that that's still too far ahead, or not even on the cards even?
That's a good question. And as you say, it is heterogeneous. So I am going to answer this from a lens of Native Americans, right? So from that particular group. And I think that the issue is that there is so little frame of reference beyond history books, what little is said here, to the media, and just kind of just that ever-present sign of us as peoples of the past, and so little knowledge, right? That it becomes hard to have those sorts of conversations. And it's very complicated, which I'll get to. But in terms of the conversation, I think the first part of it is an awareness that there are such things, such peoples as Native Americans, not just were at one point, but still are today. And that we have overcome tremendous oppression and hurdles, and we have, so many of our nations are thriving today, and that is in spite of those colonial hurdles that have been put with us. And by colonial, I mean American as much as British, for a Native American, from that Native American lens, right? Because the Americans took over from the British colonies, and they continued their own sense of colonization, and actually displacing very many of us. My ancestral homeland is in the American Southeast, centered around the town of Tupelo in Mississippi, but our actual territories span what are today parts of 4 US states. And so as American settlers moved in, basically just ignoring treaty and boundary recognitions, started to occupy our lands, and then decided they would no longer recognize our laws and forced us into Oklahoma, which is the American Midwest, in the American Midwest. And so it all continues. But in terms of having those conversations, I think that the first part of it is just the knowledge the knowledge, right? That one, we're here. The second part of that is understanding the effects of empire, and I mean British as well as American, on Native Americans, right? So from the beginning, in terms of disease like smallpox that decimated entire communities, from cultural erasure, so looking at, boarding schools that were set up predominantly in the 19th century that continued well into the 20th century, into the 1990s in some case. And this is covering the United States and Canada. So particularly in Canada, Britain did have a hand in this because it was a British colony, right? And so the Canadian Indigenous Canadians were forced to disregard their own history. They were punished for trying to speak their own language, and taught to be ashamed of themselves, right? And so there's that knowledge. And one fact that stood out to me, I learned just recently, is that looking in terms of secondary school education here in the UK, I learned that half of the history IGCSE focuses on the United States, and 3/4 of the history A-level course focuses on the United States. And that's fascinating to me, because I can only imagine infinitesimal fraction of that recognizing the indigenous peoples that were in the United States first. The peoples who British settlers came and built alliances with, right? As they try to navigate that world. And so little is said about it. I mean, that's just fascinating to me. So I think there's something in terms of education and recognizing that the United States wasn't simply just discovered and wow, there's this pristine land that's given to us to settle and do what we like with it. It was land taken from other people in oppressive ways, right? So when that sort of awareness is there, then you can start having conversations with people, I think. And I would say that to have that conversation, it has to be done jointly with other peoples affected by the empire. So I'll again use it loosely, but other indigenous peoples, right? So being able to come together, because it is heterogeneous, but collectively we paint the picture of the effect of empire, right? And so I think it's about being able to come together and support each other to have those conversations.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really, really interesting sort of set of points, and I think a lot to think about in that. But so I'll sort of ask you two more questions and then sort of open it up to the audience. I'm conscious of time, so I'd love to sort of ask you more. But so in the time that you've been here, would you say that there's been a sort of marked shift in the attitudes of people towards Native Americans in the UK particularly?
I'm going to answer that in two ways. So I've been here, I've lived here consecutively since 2004, but I have lived here off and on before that as well. So pre-2020, I would say that as Native America, people have just been interested because they've not met a Native American, or maybe they had gone to the States and met someone, or, in passing, or I don't know what, but they're interested. And there's a fascination, and they end up asking interesting questions sometimes, but just trying to learn, right? I mean, because if you don't have a frame of knowledge, where do you start? And there's so much bad information out there. So where do you start? So that's fair enough. And that's been fine. So I just carry on. But what's really stood out for me has been everything that's happened with the Exeter Chiefs, and seeing these attitudes that people had, this sort of entitlement, really. It wasn't a matter of, oh, wait, maybe this isn't such a good idea. It was about digging heels into the ground and saying, you are not going to change our branding at all. They just give whatever labels they can, or we're woke, or just overly sensitive, or we're wanting people to know nothing about us, or we don't want to be honored, or whatever else it may be. That's been interesting. And I have had many how shall I say, discussion on Twitter that gets heated. I had someone trying to point to, I don't know, some pedophilia ring towards me or something like this. It's like as a way of saying, oh, hey, why are you trying to speak up against us? We have every right to, we're trying to honor you, so just shut up and be honored, is the basic attitude that we had gotten. My problem is that I fight back and I carry on. And I think that's probably part of my native roots. My nation is known as unconquered and unconquerable. That's still a phrase that we have. And as we see for ourselves, because we have persevered through so much. And so that is something that certainly flew for me. But I did it in a way that was also engaging. So they're saying, well, we're trying to honor you. Oh, how is this honor, etc. Right? And asking them and trying to make them probe. So I would say that that has been much more difficult because all these sorts of assumptions that people might have just came to the fore. So that was quite hard. And I did feel more concerned, I think, as a Native American in that period. Now, I will also say that I have seen more people wanting to learn as well. So there have been other things. It's not just been the chiefs. It's been in Blackpool, they have a whole set of illumination exhibits. These are what they call tableaus, right? Of different ideas and things. So, hundreds of thousands of people go to Blackpool every year and see these beautiful exhibits in the autumn, as you get in towards winter. Well, one of them, there were actually two, I should say, had caricatures of one was a caricature of Native Americans. So basically Great Plains Native peoples bowing before a totem pole, which is from the far west of the United States and Canada. The two wouldn't mix in history, but that was someone's idea of Native Americans, right? And then there's another one that's caricaturing like hula dancers and Native Hawaiians. And so that also, I ended up having to raise something on that. And that got some awareness and coverage, and they are reviewing that now. The Blackpool Council recognized this as a problem. And they are doing it, right? And so it is happening. There is a greater awareness, but it's a slow journey. And I do feel like, especially after what's happened with the chiefs, that when I see something, I feel I need to say something. And we as a group, Leandra's been absolutely instrumental in all of that as well. We feel we have to, and it's like this group really has two purposes. One is to build a sense of community for people spread across this country, and to be able to talk to each other or just share thoughts and ideas or just know that we're here. But the second part of it is about being able to raise awareness of Native issues and saying something. Because if we don't, no one else will. And if no one else does, then these sorts of things stay. Right? If it happens this year, it'll happen next year. So that's where that comes into its strength.
All right, thank you. So I said one, but maybe I'm going to try and squeeze two questions.
Go for it, and I'll try to answer as quickly and well as I can.
So one is, of course, we'd love to know more about sort of what your current and future projects are, but also would you have sort of any kind of advice or just things that people should keep in mind for people who are Indigenous in the UK or in Europe more generally, just from life experience?
Wow. Okay. So I'll answer those separately. So the first question, in terms of things that I'm doing, yes, there are a couple of things I'm working on that I'm excited about. One is, I am an author. I wrote a historical fiction book called Chula the Fox, Chula, which is a Chickasaw word for fox. And it's a historical fiction book set about 300 years ago about a boy coming to terms with the loss of his father in an enemy attack. And so it's designed to bring Chickasaw culture, 18th century Chickasaw culture to life, and that period of time to life, in a way that you just cannot get in history books, especially books that are written by the people who have done the colonizing or oppressing. And so that book is now being made into a film. So the Chickasaw Nation has its own film company, and so they're now working on the script to bring that to life. So that's one project. I'm working on the sequel to that book now, which is a migration story about the same boy who's a bit older now, but he and his family have to leave their village when it's attacked by another native tribe that was inspired by the French, which is a historical event. And they end up moving eastward out of their homeland and trying to deal with a changing world. So in a way, it's a strategic decision. The world is changing. The British wanted help. And so this group of Chickasaws goes and kind of helping each other in a way, right? To get some stability in this world when you had, and at that time, 3 colonial powers trying to influence native peoples, and native peoples making different decisions about whom they would ally with, which you can imagine creates some conflict. So I'm working on the sequel to that. Also, I co-wrote a picture book with 2 other Native Americans and a Native American illustrator that retells the American Thanksgiving story. So the traditional story starts with, pilgrims that left Plymouth and went over and settled into a new world, met a few Indians, who helped them out a bit, and they had a great meal together, and then America's born. And so this kind of retells it from a Native American point of view, by looking at kind of how the world itself comes to play. And so that kind of connection between native peoples and nature, our respect for the wider world around us, right? And so how that ended up interplaying it whilst challenging those myths. But what it's doing is it's a picture book, so that it is designed to be the first exposure to Thanksgiving for the youngest of readers, whilst at the same time raising questions for their parents and others. And it's designed also ultimately to reframe the Thanksgiving story, to create a new one even. The Thanksgiving story that Americans know today comes from basically from a campaign at the height of the Civil War that culminated at the height of the Civil War for a national day of thanks. And all of these ideas about turkeys and pilgrims and Indians and so forth comes out from there. So it's a story, right? So why is that story more valid than this one? And so it's designed to put native peoples and nature at its heart. So that book was published by Charles Bridge Publishing, an American publisher based in Massachusetts, in August. And so I have a couple of trips to the US to support that book, and also some wider work on curriculum changes in American schools, to particularly around the Thanksgiving story, but also wider issues of Indigenous Native American people. I'll just leave it that way. In answer to your second question, I'm going to translate indigenous to Native Americans. I apologize. It's one of those things where I know there's a standard definition, but also it could be extended to say, well, everyone's indigenous to somewhere, right? So I'm going to slightly amend it in terms of other Native Americans in Europe. And that's, again, a surprisingly complicated question, because different European countries have even different reactions to us. In Germany, you can find people playing Indian, and there's a huge fascination with Native American culture or their idea of it. The Czech Republic as well. Leandra ran into this one in a visit. And so there are some strange places where there are some reactions you wouldn't expect in terms of what people think they know about Native Americans and how they want to embrace that culture, or if not claim it outright. And so in terms of, I think I would say two things. Number one is, and I think this is something that Native Americans would do anyway, is keeping that connection at home. So, keeping your links with your family and your nation, visit when you can. That's ever more important living afar. I say that as a father of two young children. I want my children to be as aware and as embracing of Chickasaw culture as I am. And that's hard. That's something that actually comes as a broader immigrant challenge, I think, right? So if you had emigrated from country X, whatever that may be, and that is your life, and you want to be able to share that with your children and so on, right? That's hard. And especially as their everyday life is here. So how do you embrace both cultures? How do you instill that? And I think that the case is particularly pressing for Native Americans because there are so few of us, right? So in the Chickasaw Nation, it got to a point where there were about, I want to say 30 people at one point who spoke our language fluently. 30. And we have about 60,000 citizens. Right. So the whole idea of cultural oppression did its job. I mean, we were for so long shamed for learning our language or trying to speak it in any way. And then it gets to a point where that there's only like 60 people that can speak it. And so that created tremendous work for Native American nations to educate its peoples, right? So the Chickasaw Nation worked with the Rosetta Stone, which make language software to help teach other people, among other things, to try to make the language accessible so that people can take classes and learn, right? And other Native American nations have done similar sorts of things, immersion courses and so forth, right? So there's a lot of work to revitalize. And so I would say to participate in those. Equally important is to build networks of other people that are in your country or in Europe more generally, right? And as I say, this is where what Leandra did is so vital and so instrumental. She had been able to use her network as she built up and met other people who were Native, and then took that initiative to create this group, right? And then that helped bring other people together. And I see that only growing. So we are fortunate here, but I think it's also about being able to, I think that similar work in some form has to be done more broadly as well.
Thank you so much, Tony. We're really grateful for sort of answering these questions so candidly. I mean, I'm going to open it up to sort of the audience and both online and also in this room. So those of you who are online, feel free to type in the chat and we'll read it out. But others can just sort of raise hands and we can go that way.
Are there any questions? Yeah, Emma.
Hi, thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I can't wait to see your film. And I really want to buy that book, the children's book for my children.
Thank you.
I'm from New Zealand, and I've been reading a lot about settler colonial history and Indigenous studies and Indigenous histories globally, but also nationally. I wanted to ask you, which voices are the most crucial to you in terms of, I'm not asking this well, who are you impacted by the most? Who has been most transformative in your thinking, in your activism, in your writing? And does story sovereignty or intellectual sovereignty, I don't know if you're familiar with Robert Warrior's work on intellectual sovereignty. I'm just wondering who impacts you, who's transformative for you as a writer?
To be perfectly honest with you, it's really a simple one for me anyway, and it's my own family. As a Native American, and one thing about Native Americans is that we as a whole, I think it's safe to say, the family is such an important part in terms of who we are as Native Americans. So when I go back home, I'm going back home to the Chickasaw Nation in less than a fortnight. So, and when I go back home and people meet me, they'll go, "Oh, well, you're this person's son, nephew, or or whatever it may be." And so there's always a connection in terms of who you know, to understand kind of who you are and to be able to place you, right? And so in my own family, there was genealogy is equally important as Native Americans, right? Because that goes back in terms of, again, who we are. Being Native American is fundamentally a lineal thing. You don't really emigrate as being a Native American. Whether that's right or wrong is a whole other debate and discussion, but you don't emigrate as one. You are fundamentally recognized as a citizen of a nation. So I am Chickasaw as much as I am American and I am British. Those are my citizenships, right? And so for me, it came as being an immigrant. My father died very suddenly, about 13 years ago. And so all of the questions I had growing up, were related to Cyrus Harris, the first governor of the Chickasaw Nation after removal, being sent to Oklahoma, right? Or are we really related to him or this person or that person? And so these are debates, and my uncles would go, and my father and my uncles would have questions. Oh, we're related to this person. No, we're not, and so forth. So all sorts of questions that come up. My father died suddenly, and I realized how little I actually knew, and I felt more disconnected from being home. Things that I just took for granted were no longer there, right? The idea of, I'll just go ask my dad one day is gone, so I can't do it anymore. That started a journey for me and reflection in terms of understanding and appreciating my Native American roots and identity, and then also understanding the history. So I started off by trying to understand broader Indigenous history on that continent, if you will. And so wider Native American history, what has happened overall, to therefore understand what was happening within my own nation. And then that's what led to the development of Chula the Fox. And I realized, well, you can read about things. You can read about what people ate or what God they believed in, or what happened when people die, or what they did, and so forth, right? You can read that. You can read about archaeological discovery, but that doesn't tell you who they were as human beings, right? It's objectifying them in a lot of ways, like, I don't know, kind of lab rats, for lack of a better word. I'm sure there's a better one, but it doesn't humanize them, and it doesn't bring their ideas, their worldviews, experiences to life. And that's what that book set out to do. So that started my journey in terms of writing, especially in this area, and also in terms of being an activist, because I got a greater appreciation of the issues that were affecting Native peoples. And again, I would say that it was my experience as an immigrant coming from afar, right? And realizing, well, I will never be pure British, so to speak. Every time I say something, well, I'm automatically not purely British, nor, by the way, am I pure American either. It doesn't fit anywhere. But my point is that there is an other of sorts that just happens. It's just there. And whether that's right or wrong, it's just there. And so that gave me an awareness of myself that I didn't have growing up in Oklahoma, where everyone is like, well, as American or whatever, that they came from wherever. if you see what I mean, whether it's Europe or Africa or Latin America, or being indigenous, right? We're all Americans, so to speak. And so it's a different lens to when you start traveling or living somewhere else. So it's those sorts of things, I think, that came together. In terms of sovereignty, I see, Yakoki, to that person, Chukmashki, thank you. But I was just going to say, in terms of intellectual sovereignty, I don't know enough. I would be keen to learn more about it. But I will say that there is a question here that I will take from it around what is an authentic Native American voice. And so what I mean by that is that there are issues within Native circles where there are Native writers, there are Native artists, Native activists who are Native, right, who have citizenship. I can show you, not at the moment, but I can show you my citizenship card and so on, my family and everything else. There are others who will claim to be Native American and build an entire career around this idea that they are, I don't know, Cherokee or whatever it may be. There was a US Senator, Senator Elizabeth Warren, who represents the state of Massachusetts. She ran for president, but she built her whole career about being a Cherokee, a distant Cherokee, but a Cherokee, and she wasn't, and went to great lengths to try to describe that. There are other authors who, and well-known ones, I won't go into that, but there are well-known ones that a bit of a Google search will find that make deep and extensive claims of being Native American that are not. And I think that there is a huge issue in terms of sovereignty, in terms of being who you are, right? And not claiming to be something that you are not. And I think particularly for Native Americans, but I have seen this with other people of color, particularly Black people in the United States. You had people like Jessica Krug or Rachel Dolezal, who had claimed a Black identity that was not theirs and built careers. One of them as an activist. I think Rachel Dolezal headed up the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People. Again, that's their name, in Washington State, until she was found out. Jessica Krug was a professor, I believe at George Washington University, until she was found out. Those sorts of things where they take up spaces that belong to voices of the people concerned. Right. And so I would say so my definition, and I hope I'm not too far off, and if I am, please correct me in the definition here, but I think there is a sovereignty in terms of an authenticity and of giving people space who are of that marginalized group. Does that answer it at all?
I would not correct such a beautiful answer. I'm so sorry to hear about the passing of your father. And
thank you.
Bye.
We have one question in the chat, but also there are questions in the room.
So let's do, shall we do what's the chat question, and then we'll get back to the room. So from Luca Ambe Anapubunin to everyone, Chokumashiki, for your discussion and work, what are your thoughts, excuse me, on the future of the Native American networks and communities in the UK, and perhaps in diasporic and transnational context more widely?
So do you mean the future of our UK or Native Americans in the UK group, right? I presume that's the question?
Yes.
And beyond. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I want to start that with the UK one. So I think, our group is pretty well established in terms of the network that we have going forward. And now I will just caveat this to say this is my own view. Leandra, who has led this work, could have her own thoughts on it. So this just taking that caveat there. But the way I envision this is becoming in essence, an organization that can help other Native Americans that are either living here for a long time or a short time. So thinking about, for example, students that may be at Cambridge or other universities visiting for a term abroad or studying there full time for a degree, right? And so they are, they won't know who else is here either, unless it's, again, through their own network or maybe finding someone else in their university. And so what I would like to see is this group being some sort of platform where people can come to learn about Native or just to be connected with other people, other Native American people. So that's, I think, a big part of it. I think the other part of it is around some form of education and advocacy, because as I said earlier, if we don't do it, no one will. And these sorts of caricatures will stay because there's no one else to do it and no one else that would do it. And it has to be fundamentally, I think, led by Native people in terms of what should come next. So I see that here in the UK. Going further afield, and again, I'm going to limit myself a bit because Leandra will have a voice in that very much, and I don't want to contradict that. But what I would say is I could see if this organization didn't support them directly, that it provides some sort of way of helping create something similar, say in Germany, in Italy, France, or other parts of Europe, right? So if there's some way of, even if it's got a kind of a two-tiered form, I should say, approach, like a virtual one, and then where we meet in person, say, right? So the virtual one, well, the net is automatically that much broader, or it can be, and we can be like Native Americans in Europe. And there will be specific issues within the UK. There will be other issues that may come up, say, within Germany, that have to be dealt with, but equally, there are going to be issues that we can work together on. So for example, around caricatures and mascots and building on networks that each of us has to try to help the problems in those countries, right? So I see that. The in-person part, which, I think our group met in person once with the Exeter Chiefs for Change group. I wasn't able to make it, unfortunately, but I see at some point that happening more. And that's, again, where it's going to be a bit more localized to the UK rather than pan-Europe, just trying to get the logistics of people coming in from Germany, Italy, and so forth will be that much more complicated than trying to get people in from Edinburgh, Manchester, or Devon or other parts, right? So it just complicates it that much more. But I would say that it will take its own shape. It'll take its own form as things go.
We probably have time for like maybe one or two more questions at the most, but we're mindful of the time for the next session as well. But would
just the lady at the back.
Hi, I'm Ananya. Tony, thank you so much for wonderfully sharing your experiences and for the conversation. It's deeply enriching. I'm from India and I just started teaching at a UK institution, and I found it really interesting what you talked about the curriculum, because I myself found out what students actually learn here. And
yeah, surprise.
And the fact that so little is there about the empire, and the fact that even more little is there about indigeneity, and it's so difficult to even introduce the idea. And surprised to learn that America and Australia can be called a colonial nation, like India, for example.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, because like you mentioned that you were doing wider work with curriculum changes in American schools, and whether you and the Association Native Americans in the UK are doing any conversation work with like educators or with curriculum changes in the UK, and whether you have any wider projects for that?
Yes, actually, is a short answer. Leandra in particular has been doing some work with, I'm going to get it wrong, I will say a university in Manchester. I can't remember exactly which one, so I don't want to misname, but she has been doing some work with a university in Manchester around this sort of thing. And it's something that I would also envision getting involved in as these things start to take shape. So yes, and I think that there is a need for it. As I mentioned, in terms of the national curriculum, I had no idea that so much of people studying British history end up learning about American history or some version of it. That's fascinating to me. And it just shows you how much of a need that there actually is. And again, in terms of that wider issue, in terms of empire and the effects of indigenous peoples, and I'll use that kind of in a global sense, there is so much more that needs to be done. And I think that we saw some of that in terms of the Black Lives Matter protests. But there are so many more conversations and so much more change that needs to happen. So yeah, and I think it does come within within schooling, both in primary, secondary schools, probably more so secondary school here, I should say, but also in university curricula. What is being taught? So, students learning American studies, say, if I presume there's a degree around that at Cambridge. So students that are studying that, how much of it covers Native Americans and their experience and what actually was there before there was an America? Right. And, trying to understand history of the civilizations that were there. Like, for example, there was a city of Cahokia, its ruins can now be found just outside of St. Louis in Missouri, which is again kind of in the Midwest along the Mississippi River, right? And so the city of Cahokia had trade from across the continent. It was a center of trade, much like London, and in fact, it was as large as London in the Middle Ages, and it was as regarded as a central hub. But no one knows about it. People have no idea. There's others, like, for example, Moundville, which is ruins in present-day Alabama, and the peoples that were there. They would have been likely distant ancestors of my ancestors, if that makes sense. Certainly related to us more broadly as a family. And then, looking out and further west, there are still civilizations that are there, right? How much do people learn about those? I'm guessing very little, because even in America, they don't know.
Yeah. Thank you.
Are there any final questions from the audience? Yeah, Simon?
No, just very quickly. Also to tag on to that, my girlfriend told me the other day that her friends in Barbados, her Barbadian friends, know much more about British kings and queens than they do about slavery. It's really crazy.
Wow.
Yeah. But my question very quickly.
Okay, that's telling.
Yeah, thank you very much. Extremely interesting. I was just wondering, with your kind of short section about Twitter and sort of having angry exchanges, what have you realized is the best balance between sort of coming from a place of anger, because of course you've got a lot to be angry about, the sense of injustice and genocide, but do you find that's actually productive, or is it much better to come from a kind of very much constrained argument of being sort of calm and a civilized argument in inverted commas?
Yeah, that's actually a good point. It's a balance that I constantly tried to strike. So what I did was, when people would try to challenge me, I would engage back, because if you don't engage, then their ideas stand, right? And the thing is that, given that Twitter is a public forum, then they look like they could have, quote, won, so to speak, or whatever. And then it kind of becomes a circular, how do I say, an echo chamber for for those that share their views, right? So what I did was, I didn't attack personally with people. But what I did was I looked at their ideas, and they would say, well, we're just honoring you, or you're being overly sensitive, or whatever it is. So I would take the point, well, I'm being honored. And I'd say, well, in what way am I being honored? And try to get them to respond to this. So this becomes almost a transcript, right? Each of those Twitter threads, those conversations become a dialogue that others will also at some point see. So if I can get them to flesh out their argument, and then I can take each of those points, again, calmly and with evidence, and try to explain it and point out to other sources to try to help explain it's not just me coming off the top of my head, right? And being willing to take on these questions or these challenges, right? And I actually found in more than once where it took a lot of engagement, but at some point, even one of the more ardent supporters of the Chiefs and their mascots ended up saying, okay, actually, maybe there is something here. And I had seen more than once, so actually, no, there is something, right? And so what I had done is I would take each of those challenges, I would listen, have them flesh it out, and then I would respond back to it in terms of the core of what they're trying to argue, right? So I'll take away whatever other things they might want to say about me to focus on the argument, and then respond back and openly and honestly responding back to them politely as well, as much as I can, to do that, right? And it was that sort of thing, I think, that was an important part of that success, right? So I did. If someone had raised a challenge, I responded back to them. If they tried to disregard what we were doing, I would respond back, and then make them flesh that out and respond to it. So I think it's how you do it. You're right. If you just go back and attack someone after they've attacked you, it's not going to go anywhere. But it's about trying to use it to have a dialogue that I know others will also see.